A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case that they worked or that they lived through. Some are high profile, some you've never heard of, but they're all fascinating. Today's case is about the abduction of a 16-year-old girl from a Dairy Queen in Las Vegas. She was sexually assaulted and murdered, and for more than 40 years, her case went unsolved. And then our friends at Othram Labs pulled off another miracle with degraded DNA and found her killer. And that finding made it possible for police to solve the murder of another young woman in the area. Cases like this don't always receive the attention they deserve, but today we have an extraordinary couple. They're married, Mr. and Mrs. Smith of Las Vegas, and they have dedicated themselves to documenting the crime history of Las Vegas on their website, Mayhem in the Desert. Our guests today are Megan Smith, an artist, and her husband, Anthony Smith, an attorney. Megan and Anthony, welcome. How are you?
We are doing great today.
Yeah, it's doing wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So before we get into the case, I just want to understand a little bit more about you because I think that will help us with perspective here. So how did you two end up with this fascination and this desire to document and investigate these crimes in Las Vegas?
Well, I think the starting point is we're both born and raised here in Las Vegas, and our families lived here for quite a bit. And so we all grew up hearing about some of the true crimes that really defined the city from relatives or friends and that type of thing. And then,
my mother, she worked for Metro for, 20, however long you work for. And she always used to tell us when we were younger to watch out because there are people who will cut off your arms. Yeah, she tried to scare us. And so we were talking about this one day. I told my husband and we go to look it up and it's true. And it kind of spun out from there.
Yeah, it's so there would be these tales that, Megan's mother would tell her from her work in the police department. Mm-hmm. And one of them was just a truly shocking crime that growing up, Megan did think was probably an urban legend that a young girl had been abducted here in Las Vegas. Her arms had been cut off by her assailant. She was assaulted, left in the desert. And then just we on a spur, I don't know quite what caused it, but we researched it and we went through the newspaper archives and saw this was all true. This all actually did occur. And it was a really notable case back in the 1970s or 80s. Yeah. And from there, we just started looking into other Las Vegas true crimes, and it just became got a momentum of its own in doing the research and trying to uncover this history.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing. That really is amazing. And just so people could also understand your perspective. So, Megan, you're an artist. What kind of art?
I do mostly collage art, but paint. You name it and I'll try to do it.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. And Anthony, what kind of law do you practice?
Well, I do family law.
I love it. That actually is the scariest of them all. So much, right, happens out of family law. These family disputes, these custody battles, people lose their minds and they think that murder is a problem-solving solution.
My goodness, yes. I happened to just listen to a recent episode of the podcast where you detailed some of these crimes that occur during custody cases, and it certainly hit home.
Oh, they're horrible. Well, okay, so let's talk about the case today that's very important. Again, these cases don't get a lot of attention. They just don't, and it's hard when so many decades go by. And we can also, I really want to hear your analysis of why you think it took so long to solve a case like this, and could it really have been solved in real time at the time, given the limitations, right, of forensics. So Kim Bryant was a 16-year-old high school sophomore who was abducted from the local Dairy Queen on January 16th of 1979. She had just registered for some classes. The Dairy Queen hadn't opened yet, and that was across the street from her high school. I'm going to let you two take it from here because you know so much more about this than I do.
Okay.
So what happened next?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, just a shocking tale. And I think it's probably every parent's worst nightmare. Your child abducted from essentially right in front of their school in broad daylight, probably the time when you think they're among the safest. But that's what occurred. Kim had just finished registering for classes at Western High School. And anyone that's familiar with the layout of Las Vegas, Western High School is right near a street called Decatur. And Decatur is a heavily trafficked street, so constantly cars coming and going. There were kids milling around the high school grounds. And she crossed over the street to wait at the Dairy Queen with a friend of hers. Her friend's mother came to pick up the friend, offered Kim a ride. And it's one of those tragic things where if she had taken the ride, then everything else we're about to talk about likely would not have occurred. But Kim turned down the ride, said, no, my boyfriend's going to be here in just a few minutes. I'll go ahead and hitch a ride with him. Then the time frame is incredibly narrow because from when the mother of Kim's friend leaves to when Kim's boyfriend shows up at the Dairy Queen to pick her up and she's vanished, it's only a few minutes.
Yeah. Those all happen.
Like when you say a few minutes, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
I want to say that it was within a 10 to 15 minute range.
I'd say 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, from what we recall,
That's incredible. And so what happened in this short period of time?
So many people saw her that morning and spoke with her. And I mean, she's there 1 minute, she's gone the next. And so there are a lot of interesting enough different accounts of what people saw that morning.
Yeah.
Okay. And so her boyfriend gets there and she's not there. And of course, the parents think that this is just not like her. And again, we have to give a perspective to a lot of people. It's 1979. People don't have cell phones. You need to reach someone. You call them at home or you call them at the office.
Yes.
And you leave messages, and that's how you get in touch with people. But I can assure all the young people out there, as I'm the ancient one here, I assure you it worked.
Yeah.
It was archaic by many, but it did, we did manage, like my son is like, how could you even make plans? I'm like, trust me.
we made it happen.
It was okay. So, some of her belongings are found. Where and what's found?
Well, so just the little bit of trace evidence that there is Kim's backpack in the middle of busy Decatur Boulevard. And so it's some period of time because it's about 10 in the morning, 10:30 in the morning when the abduction is occurring. And then it's about an hour later or so, I want to say 11:30, close to noon, that a passing motorist sees this backpack in the middle of the street. And, I forget if they bring it to the police or bring it to the school, but that's really the only evidence left that something untoward happened.
And so her parents are very upset at this point. She hasn't returned home. And sadly, this is still an issue to this day, maybe less so, but still a glaring issue. Parents call the police. They know in their gut something has happened to their teenager, and the police reaction is like, oh, she probably just ran off, took off. She'll be home soon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's interesting because of the time period you discussed. And, from what we see in the newspaper, looking through the records here in Las Vegas, it was common to have teenagers run away or that type of thing. And so the police, they come out to the home that day. They're looking through Kim's room, trying to see, well, is there an indication about, if she went to a friend's house or where she might be? And they look through her journal. And that's another one of these sort of points in the case where it could have gone a little bit differently. But they see in the journal that Kim detailed a fight she had with her mom.
Mm-hmm. And that she wanted to leave.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And she was making this threat of, I wish I could leave here or something along those lines, just venting as a, upset teenager. But the investigating officers saw that and they just concluded, well, it's plain what happened here. She ran away. Don't worry about it. She's probably at a friend's house. She'll be back soon. And that obviously did not happen.
Yeah. So when did they take this seriously?
Well, it was the actions of the parents again. So Kim's parents They wouldn't let it rest. They tried calling reporters. They went down to the police station, demanded action. And that's why in looking through the news archives, it's not, you would think that child abduction, nowadays, that would be all over, national news, breaking news alerts. But back then, there were several days that passed between when this daylight abduction occurred and when you first see a article in the local newspaper detailing it. And that's also so crucial because the point of that type of publicity, when something tragic like that happens, is to let the public know, because then people maybe can give tips or that type of thing.
You can look out, you can be more aware.
Some information.
I mean, here, when sadly, when Gabby Petito was declared missing, it was through so much of the work of people on social media, whether you want to call them internet sleuths or just people who care. And that helped the police tremendously backtrack and figure out where Gabby was when. And you didn't have that in 1979. But you did have the power when people, because in 79 they did watch the local news and they did read the paper daily because there wasn't internet, that if there was a local young girl who was missing, people, and you have the time, the place where she was last seen, and the Dairy Queen is something that most people would know, that you would maybe get some tips. Did they get anything?
Well, they did start getting some tips and some information at the beginning of the case, but then there was a hum of activity, and then it sort of dies down for a few months. And your point is well taken in a town like Las Vegas, because it's a big city, but it also is really a small town.
Yeah.
Because so many people will move here for just a little bit of time, but anyone that lives here for an appreciable amount, you are surprised. Just people you run into and they, knew you back in high school, or they knew your parents when they were in school or something like that. Some more publicity might have gotten more traction earlier in the case. And we particularly think that because a few months after the abduction, there was a lengthy article in the Las Vegas Review-Journal all about the case. It was a multi-page spread about it. And it was that article months after the fact that really got some of the key witnesses to come forward.
So I want to hold you right there. Yeah. So this article comes out a few months afterwards, but I want to go just back a bit, because it was about 2.5 weeks after that she went missing that Kim's body was found. So people can follow along here. So 2.5 weeks later, that would have been February 20th, 1979. Some boys hiking in the desert found Kim's remains. So she was undressed from the waist down. She had been bludgeoned with a rock, and she had been placed face down in a shallow grave.
Yes.
So at this point, it wasn't whether she had taken off or was abducted. They were certain, obviously, that she had died. Before we get to that in-depth article, unless that in-depth article you believe actually explains what I'm about to ask, is, so what did they think they had on their hands? What did police believe this was?
Well, I mean, I think that police had a kind of an open question as to who may have done this, because there were not really any eyewitnesses at that point that could say that, well, we saw this person talking to Kim right before she went missing. So I think it was just sort of casting a net and trying to see what they could find that might tie somebody to the murder.
And so then this investigative piece comes out, and you say that kind of rocked the foundation. In what sense? Who started coming forward?
Well, probably the most important witnesses, and I think when we get to the end of this case, we can come back to it, because the most important witnesses we feel in the case were two of Kim's classmates. And they were on the school grounds the day of registration when Kim was abducted. And they independently gave sketches and descriptions to police investigators of these two young men that were coming around and
kind of harassing, the girls.
Yeah, they were trying to sell them jewelry, I think, and get them to get into their car and lure them in.
Yeah.
And these two young women, they said, well, they told these guys, hey, get out of here. We're not interested. We're not getting in your car. They said that the two young men became enraged when they refused. And they were
just kind of drove off yelling, obscenities and
that they were driving an old 1950s Chevy.
Yes.
That was a key description.
A 1950s. 50s?
Exactly. Yeah, 1950. So about at that time, 79. So a 25-year-old model car. And the two men, this is a verbatim quote, but the two girls described them as, quote, grubby hippie types.
Yeah.
They said that the passenger, he was about an 18, 19-year-old male, shaggier hair. And then that the driver of the car, he appeared to be maybe in his early 20s, had a mustache. And so they were going around the campus harassing different people. And it was seen that Kim and her friend were approached by a Chevy, and some words were exchanged. It seems that Kim probably had some harsh words back to the individuals in the car, and then they angrily sped off down Decatur.
But now there are also reports that people gave that said there were 4 guys
in a
Jeep that she went off with. And someone else said it was a businessman. He had a nice car. So they thought the Jeep was
Yes.
And so is it possible that all of these things were true in the sense that could these cars have been seen? It sounds to me the most credible one would be the two friends.
Exactly.
And the description of the two guys.
Yeah, that I think is the most credible. And I think that's borne out later on as the investigation proceeds. But it's also one of those things where police operating in this vacuum that early in the case, they're trying to make this information fit. And to your question, both things could have been true. These two young men in the Chevy could have gone up to Kim, harassed her and her friend, and then sped off. At some different juncture, there could have been some men in a Jeep that approached and who knows, maybe had words or they were, checking out the Dairy Queen or something like that, and then took off.
So were these two men ever identified?
That's the thing. So the driver, no, never. There is an open question, I think, as to that passenger of the vehicle.
And can you elaborate?
Well, certainly. And it gets a little ahead in our case, but the case is going to go dormant for several decades after 1979. And there'll be moments when it comes back to life during the 1980s, but it's really not until 2021 that there's going to be resolution. And once we find out the resolution, some of these original eyewitness descriptions of that 18 to 19-year-old passenger of the car, to us at least, they make a lot of sense that might have been the key to solving the case right back then.
So you're saying that decades later, because of who gets identified through this DNA testing, that when you look back and match it to what was told to police, that it all is making sense.
It does. And it's one of those things. And as we go through the Kim Bryant case, you'll see, and from an investigator's perspective, you'll see that some of these possibilities of who Kim's murderer was, they're enticing. They seem to make sense. But this initial information that came only months after the case, it does seem to be the most accurate as to who the actual murderer was.
Okay, so then 2021, Justin Wu, the founder of the nonprofit Vegas Helps, had managed to make some funds available for the DNA testing, that there was still DNA testing or evidence that had been preserved from 1979. Now, when we're talking about this, are we talking about the backpack? Are we talking about Kim's body and clothing? Do you know for sure what was the key evidence that hit the jackpot here?
Well, and I don't know for sure, but the premise we always operated on because of how they made the DNA link is that it likely came from the body or clothing, because it had to have been genetic material from the killer. Yeah.
Amazing. So this is where Othram Labs comes in. For those of you who don't know, if you're regulars, you know who the wonderful people at Othram are. Is they're a very unique lab in the sense that they operate with degraded DNA. Basically, most labs will say if you can't get some clear DNA in a full sequence, they can't work with it. And what Othram does is they have this algorithm and this scientific just magic potion. I don't know. It's just magic what they do. I know it's all science, but they're able, even with the most degraded samples, to build a DNA sequence of who the person could be. And then you match that with genealogical information and I'll let you finish telling the story, but ultimately they identified someone who was a likely relative of the person who killed Kim.
That's exactly correct. And I think we're on the same page as you of we can't sing the praises of Othram enough. We went to a crime convention here in Las Vegas back in 2022, and we had the pleasure to get to meet the husband and wife team that run Othram. They're just remarkable people. Yeah. It's remarkable what they're doing. And yes, their work solved this case that, I'll be candid, when we wrote it up in 2019 and did the research, we did not think this would ever be solved.
No.
It just had seemed that too much time had passed. The police had really scoured, looking through the different potential suspects as much as they could. It just seemed it was at a dead end. So it was remarkable that they were able to resolve this.
This really is. Now, they end up identifying a man named Johnny Peterson as Kim's killer. They also determined that he was responsible for the murder of 22-year-old Diana Hansen in 1983. She disappeared while on a jog and was later found in the desert not that far from where Kim was discovered. So who is this Johnny Peterson?
Oh, would you think fair to say that Johnny Blake Peterson is something of a question mark?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, just
really
very little information that we can find on this fellow. So again, when the news broke that Johnny Blake Peterson was identified as Kim's killer through this genetic evidence, and it was ironclad that he was the one that did it, we immediately looked through the newspaper archives, searched obituaries to find any information that we could on Johnny Peterson. And the only thing we really found, one was a mugshot, but we couldn't see what arrest or what crime that had been tied to. And then the other article we found was his obituary in the local Las Vegas newspaper. Yeah, so 1993, at age 32, Johnny Blake Peterson died at a Las Vegas hospital. There was no indication of a cause of death. What little we were able to garner about him is from that short obituary that he worked as a plasterer and a contractor, that he was married, and that he had 2 children. And then he died at obviously a very young age, suddenly. So we don't know if it was illness, if it was a self-inflicted type of thing. We don't know.
So here's what I don't understand about Johnny Peterson. You say you found a mugshot in your research, which means he was arrested. But his DNA or his fingerprints or any of that stuff, was any of that in the system in CODIS, which is the criminal database of DNA of criminals?
Well, it doesn't seem like it, because, and also given the time frame with Peterson dying in 1993, the arrest obviously occurred in the early 90s, perhaps the 1980s seems most likely, honestly, based upon the style of haircut and thing like that of Peterson. But at that time, I just don't think that it was common practice to take genetic material from people that were arrested or convicted of a crime. And I think we were, or at least for me, I recall that it wasn't really till the early 1990s when you would see things on court TV back in the day that genetic evidence really started to be more used in murder cases and things like that. So I just don't think it's really on the radar.
No, and then we've had this, sadly, I don't, it's a state by state thing, but I know here in California, one of the things we're struggling with is that the laws have changed, and so you're no longer taking DNA evidence from lower level offenders. And as a result of that, you are missing a DNA pool of perhaps repeat offenders that might make it possible for you to solve some crime. So while we've taken all these steps forward, there are many who, have a feeling that this is kind of going backward a bit. But this is a huge debate between, different levels, felonies versus misdemeanors. And I'm not trying to go on a tangent there, but it's part of the greater discussion about how you can find this information. And so much of this DNA that Othram has been working with, and then them building the sequence to figure out who the person was, and then finding matching similar sequences to find out who a living family member may be in order to figure out who that is kind of fallen into an area kind of outside of the police because of that. And so, there are implications on both sides. So I'm curious here, when this announcement was made, was it, we talk about justice a lot on this program. Where is the justice here? The police have concluded he's the killer, but he's dead. Can't get any justice there. How did the family take this?
Well, I believe that Kim's mother had passed away, but her father was still alive when news broke. And there was a quote from him that he was grateful to have the closure in it. Because I think that you're correct. There's not really the sense of justice the family can have from seeing punishment, consequences to Peterson for taking their daughter from them. And that's just a terrible thing that they're never going to get that aspect of it.
I just hope that they got some peace in knowing some finality. And unfortunately, that's the best that they can get with this case.
Well, I mean, that is, of course, still sad and very tragic. Mm-hmm. But there is a level, and I use this word, I think it's a level of respect for the individual to, just because they've been dead for a long time and maybe their killer or killers are dead, they're still owed an answer and the respect of finding out what really happened to them. I think
Absolutely.
That's important.
And we try to put ourselves into the shoes of someone that is gone through that unthinkable experience of having a loved one taken from them, which is horrific in its own right.
Yes.
But then to not know who was responsible for that crime, it just has to be unbearable.
Yeah.
So I want to play a clip. I want to play a clip here from the Las Vegas Police Department. This is Lieutenant Ray Spencer discussing not only Kim's case, but then this other case. And this is from the police department.
For the next 38 years, the LVMPD homicide section continued to work leads on this case. However, detectives were unable to identify Diana's killer. Thanks to advanced DNA testing and genealogical research conducted by Othram Labs, investigators were able to identify Kim's murderer as Johnny Blake Peterson. After this discovery, detectives received additional information regarding Peterson's possible involvement in the murder of Diana Hansen. As a result, detectives requested a direct comparison of DNA evidence recovered from Diana's body to that of Johnny Peterson. This comparison confirmed that Johnny Peterson was the suspect who murdered and sexually assaulted Diana Hansen. Peterson died in 1993, so no arrests will be made in this case. Detectives are continuing to review other homicide cold cases for any possible connections to Peterson. This case is yet another example of the lengths that our detectives will go to in order to bring justice and closure to the families of murdered victims.
So, in essence, 2 murders have been solved. Are there more? And what do we think was going on with Peterson? Was he a serial killer? Since nothing is known about him, and a serial killer is a different type of killer, I'm just very curious here what you all found out.
Well, unfortunately, also around this time, a lot of women were going missing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we found a headline from the 1980s in Las Vegas about, and Kim was included among them, but 24 unsolved cases of murders of young women in the city, either during the late 1970s or during the early 1980s. And because these cold cases and trying to bring attention to them is important. An area that we spend time frequently going to is the Las Vegas Police Department cold case website. And by decade, they list some of the notable cases. And when you start looking at the 1980s, there are a lot of women that seem of the same age, maybe went missing under similar circumstances, or the body was located under similar circumstances as Kim Bryant and Diana Hansen. And the mind obviously goes to, I don't think all of these were tied to Johnny Blake Peterson, but Metro has made the comment that up to 5 murders could ultimately be linked to Peterson. And so I think it definitely is out there that some of these unsolved murders may be linked to him. As to whether he's a serial killer, and by the FBI definition from last time we looked, I think it's 3 murders with a cooling off period in between. And here, between 1979 and then in 1983, he's committed 2 murders. It would be very surprising to us if there were not other murders that he committed during that time.
Yeah.
And a case that I think stands out to us is of Catherine Tighe. It's spelled Tighe, but she was also a high school student that in 1980 or 81, she went missing from Chaparral High School, and her body was later found in the desert, murdered. And that case still remains unsolved. So, but that certainly was the type of MO of Peterson. So I think that highly likely he was a serial killer.
It's just so disturbing, and I think context is everything, because that would have been a very different time in Las Vegas. And I shared with you before we started recording that I was a reporter in Atlantic City for 5 years for Philadelphia TV station. So I covered South Jersey, but very specifically Atlantic City. And there tends to be, when you have, and this is at the time when there were only 2 places in the U.S. where you could gamble. They were just starting the Connecticut Indian-run casino. That was just emerging as I was leaving Atlantic City. So I'm just giving you a frame of where you could gamble in the United States. And because of these 2 unique places, you have the real life organized crime, influence, and crime associated with these cities because of the business that's being conducted. And then when you have gambling, which is a vice, you add all the other vices and the crimes that come with them. So crime reporting and crime in these 2 cities at both those times it's a unique situation, unlike other cities. You have additional criminal elements that maybe most other big cities don't have in the concentration that Atlantic City and Las Vegas did, and still do. And people really did go missing. But, I covered a lot of organized crime, and there were a lot of murders that were associated with crime figures, and where they always ended up, it wouldn't have been in the desert, it would have been in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. That is where every body was dumped. But it's just so fascinating, because what you're describing here with Kim and Diana and this Peterson killer is just normal women doing, one girl very excited, choosing her classes, right, being picked up by her boyfriend, another one going out for a jog. These are not associated in any way, it appears, with gambling and any of those associated crimes that come with that industry.
No, not at all. And it's excellent points, because that time period when Kim was abducted in 1979 and murdered, anyone that has seen the movie Casino or read the book, that is right at the height of that time period with Tony Spilatro and these just terrifying organized crime figures. But you're correct that neither Kim or Diana were not tied to gambling,
just completely random.
Yeah, just normal everyday women.
You're just doing what you do. It's just you go about your everyday life, and you're not thinking about that, especially when you're a teenager. You're not as aware, and Wow.
It is. And a point that struck me with your comment is with Atlantic City and with Las Vegas, I think, especially at that time, when they're the only communities in the country that really allow legalized gambling, it's very easy for someone who's not living in either of those cities to think, well, that's all it is. That's the surface level. It's gambling. But as we said, Megan and I were born and raised here. Our family has lived here for decades, and it's a normal town. It's a normal city, and there's kids that go to register for classes, and there's women that go for a jog in their neighborhood, and just people doing everyday things they do in any other community in the country. I will say, though, that because Las Vegas at that time in the early 1980s had maybe a population of 500,000 people. And these crimes did ripple through the community here. My mother, she was a regular jogger and, would jog all the way out to the desert and back into town. And when something like the Diana Hansen case happened, I mean, it left her shook.
We have family members that went to the same school. It's for his side of the family and my side of the family to both know about this case that happened so many years ago just shows you kind of how sensational it is.
And the impact it left on the community, even all those decades later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's it. I think we don't discuss enough the impact on the community because, our justice system is like the community is involved in hearing the evidence, right? That's your jury and making a decision of whether this person is guilty or not. And then also sometimes involved in the next phase of it. It depends on, courts and states and how things are done. And so I think community is incredibly important in the discussion, the greater discussion of crimes and how they affect people. And the community has a right to have a greater conversation about the impact here. I'm curious, your website has a lot of different cases that you all have focused on. And I'm wondering, you have this already established real Las Vegas. You've been there for generations. What has the discussion been like? And have you grown this community in is it still a very personal community or do you have a lot of other people that are joining your conversation?
I mean, we have plenty of people that will email us or reach out to us with their own crime stories or they'll ask us for more information.
We will touch on that later.
We can touch on it now if you want to.
Yeah, the Ronnie Fane,
Yeah. We had a serial killer convicted killer reach out to us about an article that we wrote and said, this is not what happened. And we asked him, he said, well, would you like us to help you share your side of the story? And yes, he did. He never got back to us, but I think he was happy knowing that there are people that would listen to his side of the story.
But the question is with these serial killers, which, we have people in prisons who are constantly confessing to things. Mm-hmm. And it's all a lie because they need the attention. Mm-hmm. And they're also sitting in prison. And so I'm curious, was this credible? Have you been working with the police on that? What do you do in a situation like that?
Well, it was interesting because it actually ties into the Kim Bryant case. Mm-hmm. The fellow that contacted us was named Ronnie Fane. And early in the Bryant case, they thought that Fane might be the nexus in solving who murdered Kim Bryant. Because Fane was a bit of a drifter from California. He was here in Las Vegas. He gets arrested for the murder of this man named Bobby Jean Thomas. And Bobby Thomas went missing the day after Kim Bryant's abduction. And so they ultimately find his body out in the desert. They arrest Fane for this murder. Fane confesses to the murder, but he says...
Which murder?
To the murder of Bobby Thomas.
Okay.
But he tells the police, hear me out, because Bobby Thomas confessed to me while we were out drinking with some friends at Mount Charleston that Bobby Thomas killed Kim Bryant. And Fane told the investigators that enraged me so much that I couldn't control myself and I stabbed Bobby Thomas to death. They then put Fain through 2 polygraph exams, and he passed both of them.
Flying colors.
Yeah. And so they had him confess in open court. It's interesting because we did pull the court transcript from his confession, and he gets the dates wrong about what Bobby Thomas told him allegedly about the Kim Bryant murder. And then the judge has to kind of step in to say, actually, no, it was this date, and then goes on to get the rest of the confession. It ultimately turns out, obviously, that Bobby Thomas had no involvement, and the homicide detectives on the Kim Bryant case were suspicious right from the get-go that Thomas had any link to the case. But interestingly, when Fain reached out to us, it wasn't to say, I didn't do it, I'm innocent. It really was to clarify one aspect of the crime. To be blunt, I don't mean to be graphic, but the initial news reports about the murder of Bobby Thomas noted that he had been sodomized. And so the point of Fain reaching out to us was to explain that that was not his doing, that wasn't true, but not to dispute the overall crime.
Yeah.
But again, we've tried to move with our work into some of the journalistic aspects of it, of getting original documents and conducting interviews. And so that's why we did extend of, if you have more to say about this Bobby Thomas case, then certainly we will hear you out and interview you on that. But like Megan said, there was no real follow-up. So
yeah,
he needed to say what he needed to say because it's all about him.
Yeah,
well, exactly. And that's the thing. It's interesting.
No, I was just going to say, I find it very interesting that he saw a way, but he didn't do it. He just wanted to know that he could if he wanted to.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because there was another article that kind of called into question Ronnie Fain's credibility, because apparently when he moved to Las Vegas in the late 70s, he had ideas of becoming a new Charles Manson. To your point about all eyes on me, I need the attention. When you want to be a cult leader, that's a pretty narcissistic sign, I think.
Wow. So, yes, you have interesting people who are contacting you. But that's wonderful. I mean, look at all this information that you're gathering and that you are building a library, as I would call it.
Yeah.
And we try to show what the true crimes that we cover say about Las Vegas at the different time.
We try to leave out any bias. We don't want people to know our opinions. We just want to share the story of these people.
Exactly. And try to bring it to light. And that's why we do cover everything from, a lot of people don't know that Las Vegas was an Old West frontier town when it first started. And so we cover crimes of the Old West of,
1920s is the earliest.
Well, I think 1905, because Megan's grandfather or great-grandfather actually came here from Mexico in about 1915 and worked on the railroad here in Las Vegas. Wow. And it was just saloons and brothels, and
it was the Wild West.
It was
the Wild West, and that's what the West was at the time. It absolutely was. I'm curious, you two. You're fascinating, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Absolutely fascinating, and you're also very charming and delightful. What do you have a goal here with your Mayhem in the Desert website? What do you want to see happen?
Well, we have already kind of reached our goal. We never thought out to do this for us. I mean, it's something that we enjoy doing, but it was never about any one person or any one thing. It's just, something that we talked about one day. And from there, we found out just between us and our people we know about so many crimes that were never solved or were in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, no. Well, just when you mentioned family, I think that was part of it, too, because it's one thing to read about these crimes, maybe in passing, in an old news article or something, but different to hear from like my aunts or your aunts or mom about how these crimes impacted them and how that still impacts them.
Yeah.
And you can tell on an emotional level. Like my aunt went to school with one of the missing women in the 1980s who later, was tragically found murdered. And she remembers being in class with her in Clark High School. And, you know, so those memories never go away. And that was part of it too, is being able to fit these stories into a larger context.
And I don't know if this is what happened initially, but I was a witness a little while ago in a murder trial. Ooh. And that I was young, so that was very difficult, but it also gave me a little insight. And so that is something that I wanted to write about with my husband, you know, because he's the person that can really, you know, help me write it. But also we have other personal stories that we didn't even think about until we started writing. My father was killed by a drunk driver. And as easy as that sounds, they were...
No, it's not easy.
No, I mean, how clear cut.
Oh, I see.
In that sense. Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
excuse me. Yes.
But there are so many things behind the case that have not been mentioned. And that's very huge for our family. And so it's for everybody. It's for everybody.
Yeah. And we try to keep that in mind, having, like I said, Megan directly been the victim of a horrific crime. And in that case, you know, we talk about justice a lot. That killer that murdered her father and another woman in the car only served 2 years.
2 years. She may have been in for 2.5, 3. But they let her out before even we had no idea that she was at a you know, a group home, but they were letting her go to work. She had a job, and that was just kind of it was there's a lot of soul crushing things about that, but it was just she got a slap on the wrist, you know, and she ruined our family. I mean, my dad was a cornerstone, and she just ripped us apart. You know?
Yeah, and I'm so sorry.
But I think that's how we can understand and empathize. And because we have been through it, we're just not telling other people about whatever we find. We've been through it. We know. We want to help if we can.
Yeah, and we want to be sensitive in telling these stories. And so we try to use some of that background of what it's like to be a victim of a violent crime like that. As we tell these stories.
I think it's fascinating. I think it's, you know, I think there's some soul cleansing that happens with this, because clearly you two are very respectful individuals. And so your approach in telling these stories is with that level of respect for all involved. And you know, some people just want to tell salacious stories. Some people, you know, and that's a problem. That's a disservice. Again, it all comes back to, for me, is all about respect. And these cases that didn't get the attention that they really deserved, how that attention would have helped in real time when these were happening, no one can say for sure, right? We don't know for sure. But they shouldn't be forgotten. And I think that's what I appreciate so much about what you do. It's about the forgotten.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and it's a big part of it. And like we said before, I think, and I don't want to speak for Megan, but in this entire process of writing about true crime, Othram, the directors of it, coming to us and saying that in some small way that the narrative we were able to lay out, the sort of lay of the land about who the potential suspects were in the Kim Bryant case, to know that it helped in any small way, it makes our work tremendously worth it.
That was a really incredible moment to know that something we wrote actually got solved. It aided someone in solving, you know, 30-year-old case.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah,
it is amazing. It's a gift, and congratulations, you know, for your hard work. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise.
It's been lovely. I you know, if you ever have a case that you're like, no one is paying attention, please reach out to us. You know,
absolutely.
We try to cover a variety of cases, not just big headline cases, but other cases. We do both. But so where can people follow you, find more information about what you're doing and the forms in which you are investigating these cases?
Yeah, well, the key place to follow us is at our website, and that's mayheminthedesert.com.
We're on social media, so Facebook, Mayhem in the Desert.
Yeah, Instagram, and I believe you can search either under Mayhem in the Desert or Vegas True Crime. We're on Twitter, X, Reddit. We regularly post there into a community, a subgroup, Vegas True Crime.
Oh wow!
So you can find us in a few. We're creeping around somewhere.
We love that. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's our program for this week. Megan and Anthony, thank you again for being our guests. You can always find me at Anna G News on all social media. You can find our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, True Crime News, and sign up to receive our newsletter at truecrimenews.com. Until next week, this is True Crime News, the podcast, and I'm your host, Ana Garcia. As we always say, don't do crime.